Hey guys, and welcome back to Grizzly Valley. Today I'll be working on a small restaurant for the Japanese area, as well as some overall detailing of specifically this plaza, and also some flat rides around here, and a small simple transfer track for the B&M coaster, which is secretly a mine train, at least without any other options at the moment, and also the general refurb basically of the Japanese area. But yeah, this restaurant is something that I really wanted to have here, just to have a small, sort of traditional Japanese restaurant in this area. And much like the hat shop, and I think this is really an approach which I do want to follow a little bit more, which I do in this building as well, is that I want to have the store at a location which is reachable for the people in the game, or at least at the moment, so something which is actually connected by paths. And near the side of that, I do want to have a patio to sort of make it look like a restaurant, and add some simple tables and chairs there, but it's not actually a functional restaurant, but at least it's sort of functional since it has the store on the side. But yeah, this is a restaurant in a sort of fictional sense that I want to make it as another realistic looking restaurant, but not actually be functional at all. Though on the topic of that, I did use the barrels for tables and chairs again, which there are definitely some other ideas for as well, which I should probably get into and might also replace them at some point in the future, but that's really just some tinkering that I may do at other points in time. I just want to focus the time lapses on really getting the most general and the things that require the least tinkering, basically, because I really like to go in the game and place things and remove them until I'm happy with stuff and just have a lot of trial and error to get things exactly right. And that's the type of stuff which I want to avoid in time lapses, and I really want to get in videos. I really want to do the most important work, really laying down the areas and how buildings are going to be laid out, and also a bit of foliage in this episode, which is actually more or less the first time in which I'll be doing foliage on a larger scale, but it's pretty important in this case since I am going to need some barrier of foliage between the Asian area and the Alpine area to at least get a transition there, and also some more ornamental foliage like small bushes and flowers around small plazas like this. And the way I really wanted to do foliage is quite simple, especially considering there aren't too many trees yet, but quite many trees just sunken into the ground to have some low shrubbery and some trees in between that here and there. Though I did not want to make it too dense, really, since I don't think I need it. There is enough space to have the shrubbery and the trees side by side, and you don't find really large shrubbery like that with also trees above that. So I sort of wanted to mix it but not place it all over each other and make one giant tree line. So it will be a bit of a more natural forest, and you can still see the other areas of the park if you look through the leaves very carefully. Anyway, I also wanted to have a small torii gate, or it's not so small actually, it's a triple torii gate, which is quite a rare sight actually, but it's the only thing which really fits over the entire width of the path, and really figured I wanted to have a real entrance thing for each area of the park, and obviously for a Japanese part, a torii gate would be the most fitting thing, and I think I'll be adding that around every entrance of this part of the park. And then also some other foliage over here, trying to get it as large as I could within this area, just to make sure that you don't really see the rest of the Alpine area from the Japanese area, and also have some small path elements, like some small wooden benches, because I didn't really get to that yet. And back to the restaurant, where I still needed to finish a lot of it. Though I do have to say about this restaurant, it's one of the buildings which I originally built as prototypes before I actually started making this part of the park. One of the reasons why it actually took me a while to get to making this was the fact that I really wanted to make a couple of buildings beforehand and test the theme a little bit. And one of the buildings that came out of this was an exact copy of this restaurant. And looking back at the file which I had of the prototypes, I really figured that this building was good enough to at least copy over from that. So this was pretty much just built from reference, and nothing that I came up with on the spot, which also did help to make it a little bit more quickly, and nothing really took trial and error, and there was nothing where I really had to see how it would look, so I do think it resulted in a bit of a better time lapse, but I can't really build the buildings every single time before I start doing the time lapses. Sometimes I even get the buildings better than the first time around, which is kind of strange, but it happens, I guess. And it's also a very similar building to the buildings which I already had, though I should probably say the buildings, like the station, is very similar to this building, since this was more or less the original prototype of the theme. Since I did make a couple of buildings to test the theme, but this one most resembles the buildings that I currently have in this area. Aside from the fact, though, that later in this episode I'll be replacing the roofs, but that's something which I should talk about by then. There were also some comments about the fact that I used way too many windows in the station, which is definitely very true, and that is something which I didn't want to do, but I sort of was looking for a way to get that bottom wooden base floor texture in, because base floors in Japanese buildings quite often have like a completely wooden base floor, but I was really afraid that if I would go with the exact same wooden beams as the one which I use for the framing, or for the frameworks, you wouldn't really see the contrast in the textures between them, and you could barely really tell that there are frames at all, and there's just a lack of visible detail in that, which is why I wanted to go with the windows originally. But this was a building where I did go with the wood, and where I think it fits a little bit better as well, since buildings like these do have more windows generally, I think, than temples do. And it is a pretty simple building. It's actually not inspired by restaurant buildings in Japan, but really by traditional houses. Though I do have to say, I started out with this larger part of the building, and the little wing which is next to it is really only there to actually allow the stall to be in there. Which, if this were just the restaurant, I would probably leave the wing out, but just for the purposes of making this actually functional and people able to get their cheap beef burgers there, I really wanted to have that small wing with a little stall in it, so that it could be functional as well. And for the patio, I wanted to use it partly just to make this look a little bit more realistic and like it's an actual restaurant, but also to decorate the plaza a little bit and add some things around it and really give it a bit of a functional, well, a function really. So I really figured this would be pretty nice to have in the middle here, with some tables here and there and some trees around it and some smaller decorations, which is what I decided to go with in the end. Plus it's actually pretty much one of the best views you can probably get with the corkscrews right there, and also a good way to at least keep the plaza sort of closed, because I obviously did want to put things around the plaza and not just leave the area around it empty and with foliage. But it's also a way to keep it more open, to be able to get the camera shots of going right through the corkscrews. And I don't think this is something which I've shown off yet, but one of the most important parts of this plaza in general is how the corkscrews go over it. And as you look through corkscrews in a line perpendicular to the direction the corkscrews are going, you can see a sort of spiral shape, and that's really one of my favorite camera angles when it comes to roller coasters in general, if not my favorite. And I really wanted to preserve that as a sort of sight line, which is why I also wanted to leave this area around the plaza a little bit more open, with less buildings and less trees, to at least make sure that you still have this sight line of the corkscrews going over the plaza. And by having that little restaurant part, I could at least make sure that it wouldn't be an empty grassland, and at least had some sort of function and detail to it. And this little building over here, I figured, which I did actually keep the blue roof with, at least for the time being, I can always get rid of that at some point in the future, is just a small Q roof, which isn't that common for small flat rides like the Octopus over here. But there was some empty space here, and it's better to probably have a small building over there than have nothing. So wanted to just have a quick simple queue line building there, just to make the entire area feel a little more coherent, and have another building, which also kind of helps to have another building in here. Which on the other side of the Octopus, I wanted to put a whirly rig and sort of make this the main flat ride area of the this part of the park, which also makes it really seem the most theme park part-ish. And there's nothing really special about it. There were just a couple of ideas that I wanted to go with. I really wanted to make all the paths in this area really curve around a lot, just making use of the actually somewhat flexible path system. And I have to be quite honest, it's one of the things which I criticize the most about this game, is the fact that the path system can just be really annoying to work around with. And I'll just be honest about it, that I really didn't like it at first, but it's actually got some qualities in the sense that obviously it has curved paths, and with a lot of tinkering and trying to get the paths to actually get where you want to, you can actually make some pretty nice curved plazas and small roads that sort of squiggle everywhere, so I did want to make use of that over here, and also raise the flatrides a little bit. Not just because flatrides in real life are quite often raised as well, but just to get more depth into this area than just having a flat field of flatrides, which if you have an area with some flatrides with just paths going in between them and not much else, you do very quickly get this flat ride plaza idea, where there's just one ground floor and there are paths and there are flat rides, but it's all sort of just on one big parking lot-ish space, and I really wanted to avoid that, and just by raising the flat rides, you do get more of the idea that as you're walking over the path, you're sort of walking through a Japanese valley with all the rocks on the sides. And I obviously could also decorate the flat rides a little bit more by having them connect with rocks on the sides of them, and some small flowers and trees and little lanterns hanging around. So that's why I really wanted to make it that way. And over here is where I wanted to have the quick transfer track. Now I do have to say this is also something which I might want to return to in the future, because I opted for a very simple transfer track station, just pretty much figuring, well, transfer tracks in real life don't really have any type of fancy building to them usually. But this is one of the things which I may want to return to, but I'm not really sure if I want to. Because looking back at time, and this is something which I've also said in the last episode, the Alpine area almost looks a little bit dated. Like, I've gotten already better at the game, I think, since I built the Alpine area. But it's also a bit simple. It doesn't really do anything out of the ordinary. It's sort of an ordinary Alpine theme, and that's it. And because of that, it doesn't really do anything, I wouldn't say ridiculous, but to step out of that sort of generic Alpine idea. So it doesn't really have any overly detailed or unrealistic type of towers or things sticking out or random small roofs here and there, which would maybe be more theme parkish and less realistic, perhaps. But basically what I'm trying to say is that it maybe could use some more roofs and little nooks and crannies sticking out and details like that just about everywhere, which is something which I may want to get back to in the future. But yeah, at the moment at least I have the basic shape and general layout of the area, which is probably at the very least the most important thing to get right, and I can always go back and add some extra detail and add extra stuff to it to make it look a little bit better. Which I do have to say, I don't really agree with the saying which I do often hear people say, that is, sometimes you just need to keep adding stuff for buildings to make them look good, which is something which I partly do believe in. It's definitely a very detailed building is obviously in most cases going to look more interesting than a completely flat, boring building. But it's not really something that automatically makes your buildings good. And while adding loads of details can make a building look okay, I think really the main difference between an okay building and a really good building is it being well laid out, well shaped, and in general having a good sense of overall composition of what the building should be. And that's why I always think that's the most important part. You can always go back to sugarcoating it at some point by adding lots of details, but it's not everything to your building, I would say. But yeah, that's that very off-topic discussion. Back to this building, it is a very simple building, like very much just like the Alpine buildings I had so far, very much like a Tyrolean building. The only real issue with that is perhaps that the roof is very steeply slanted for a Tyrolean building, which have more gentle roofs, but aside from that, it's pretty much just Austria. And I might also, if this were realistically Austria, have some sort of different texture and color on the roof, obviously, which are still all blue, but I'm not sure if I will actually replace the roofs with different things. Because yeah, this is something I should address, because I think it's quite a game changer, at least for this alpha. Kukamonda on Shy Guy's World, and also on YouTube. I should put a link in the description, because his stuff is really amazing, and his buildings are really amazing, and some of the best I've seen in Planet Coaster so far. But he had the actually amazing idea to put signs on roofs, which was actually quite funny, because I remember the first time I remember when I uploaded the first Japanese section video on YouTube of this park, I got a compliment, but followed up by, well, if only there was a way to get rid of these blue roofs. And lo and behold, a couple of days later, he actually found a solution, which I sort of want to use in the rest of the Japanese area to get rid of the blue roofs, which you'll see in a bit. But I think it could also be quite useful in other areas of not just this park, but pretty much anyone playing Planet Coaster, any theme we have so far, since the blue roofs are pretty much all over the place, but you can slap signs on them to change their color, as goes with walls, but walls are a little harder since they have a completely different shape and obviously also details attached to them, and don't quite as often have many different colors as roofs do, especially in an alpine theme. But I may want to get back and slap some signs onto the roofs to give them different colors and different textures, because it's actually a really amazing thing to try. And while it isn't something which looks that great, it's at least a good way to move away from the very repetitive look of blue roofs everywhere. But yeah, that's something which you'll see in the rest of this video and also in future videos perhaps. And just for 1 second, I also wanted to get back to this little area with the flat rides and at least do a little bit of very simple theming around the whirly rig. Just a bit of bushes placed around everywhere. I'm not much of a person who likes to place bushes actually in very specific increments or very specific distances between them. Just sort of plop them around in whatever way looks good and almost sort of natural. Anyway, this is the part where you can actually see how it looks with the signs posted on the roofs to give them a different color than the blue roof. This is something which I may also still go back to, and it's something which I ended up doing mostly off camera. I just added this small time-lapse part in here just for a good measure to actually show what it looks like in the end and how it's done, so that maybe some other people can actually take this. Though again, this was not my idea, this was completely Kukamonda's idea, but it works out really well. There are definitely some gripes to it still. The fact that the texture is far from perfect. If this were realistically Japanese buildings, I would have a tiled roof texture, which there is in the game, which is the Spanish tile roof, but that is obviously not going to work out too well either. And another issue is maybe that it's a large texture. It does have some fairly realistic wooden plank texture to it, but you can sort of tell that it's more of a plastic sign plank texture. And another issue is really on the color. I really hoped to find some way to actually get black roofs or very dark grey brownish roofs as you very commonly see in Japan, but there is just simply no way to get that in here. I did try some other pieces, but none really worked, and one thing that can come sort of close is using these sandstone brick pieces to cover your roofs, but those sort of glitch when you zoom out. The LODs aren't so great. So in the end decided to not go with that either, just leave these wooden signs on here to replace the roofs with, which does take some getting used to, but at least I'm glad there's a way to get rid of the blue metal roofs. And the biggest change was actually in the Pagoda, and that was also the biggest thing time-wise, since it actually took me, I think, like 2 hours to get that thing to be, well, at least somewhat decent with these signs, since obviously they're really big signs, so to get the actual shape of a pagoda going took a lot of trial and error and getting these things in the exact right position. Anyway, that's it for the time-lapse for today, and I'll go back to a real-time part to show you what it looks like after the couple of hours of redoing this area. So I'd like to take this bit of real-time part to at least show off what I have in this area so far, because I haven't done that a single time, even though my FPS is pretty low. I'm on a pretty good 16 FPS at the moment, so I am sorry about that. It's actually definitely started to tank a little bit more since I added all the different roofs and details, especially goes for foliage as well. Regardless though, I cannot thank Kukamonda enough for that amazing idea to put these signs on the roofs, which I think really made the area look a lot better. Only few nitpicks that I maybe still have is that it's very similar to the path colors, so especially when looking down like this, you do see a lot of similarities between the path and the roof, and it's sometimes hard to really tell them apart very easily. Though apart from that, it's a much more realistic roof color and works so much better than the awful blue as well. And the only exception to that as well, which is another small nitpick, is that it just didn't really work out on the Pagoda. There were many different things actually which I tried, and I think I spent about 2 hours almost trying to see what would actually work, but this was in the end what I wanted to come up with. It's perhaps still a bit unfinished, I might add some extra things along the sides, but this is pretty much how I wanted to make the roof in the end. The main issue was the top really, which the sign, as good as it actually looks as a roof, is very large and you can't really sink it into the ground here since there's the building underneath it here, which I really wanted to keep stucco, and it's too large to actually point toward the middle, so I had to actually get a number of different objects over there to at least make it look like something, but it's really one of the weakest links I think of the area. Though that said, I think it definitely worked best for the station, which I'm really happy with, and it is still a bit of a work in progress. There are some smaller details which I might tinker with a little bit more, but that said, as I've said before, I really want to tinker and mess with some smaller details off camera just because it's a much better time to play stuff and remove it again and play stuff and remove it again until you're actually happy with it, which is actually what really creeps into the most amount of time that I spent working on the park. But yeah, this is how it looks at the moment. There are just a couple of things that I still need to make before it's finished, like some small string of facades over here, I think. I've tried a couple of things for this pavilion already, and I'm not entirely sure what I'll do with that. I did try, which works out somewhat well, though it took quite a bit of time to use all of these concrete beams like these ones and set them into a certain pattern using mock roofs next to it to actually shape these beams into a Japanese roof, which is somewhat doable. The only reason why I decided to not go with it yet is because I'm still on the fence about the color. Obviously it is a grey color, so it doesn't work out that well, but the alternative is use the blue roofs, which I can't use these signs on, and which also doesn't allow for a true Japanese roof shape, so I may in the end just go with putting a lot of concrete beams together. But you'll see that in the next episode in that case, and also how it's done. But yeah, this is now the Japanese area with the new roofs and also some different lighting and some more details pretty much around everywhere. So yeah, the next plans are to add this facade here, or maybe a small picnic park over here, perhaps work on the entrance area, but I've also got quite a number of ideas about a Roman theme which I'm planning around here, and maybe, though this is a pretty big maybe with a capital M, a Dutch area around here, which I'm not entirely sure if I'll go with it, but I think it's somewhat feasible and would love to mess with it a little bit, at least play with the idea. Anyway, thank you guys for watching this episode, and see you guys in the next one.